Mr. Tony Blair, good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to learn something about leadership tonight, which is why I feel that we're so privileged to have such a prominent leader like yourself with us. And I want to ask you if there was one single moment in which it all transpired to you, that is the moment in which I have to be a leader. I am the one in charge. The choices are heartbreaking, but I have to take them.
I think for me, it was amongst all the difficult decisions, I remember one particular moment when just after the July 2005 bombings, in which over 50 people had died
in
London, we were getting then continual warnings of fresh attacks. And the trouble was, every time we had a warning, we shut down the whole of our infrastructure. London came to a halt. It was a really difficult time for the country. And this went on for a time, and finally I decided we had to take a decision that we were going just to ride it out and to keep the network open.
Anybody watched you, looked at you and told you it's your decision to make?
We were sitting around the table. We had received another warning that there was going to be an attack. They thought the warning wasn't right, but we didn't know. And I went around the table and asked everyone what they thought, and we weren't quite sure, and I finally said to one of the leading security people, "So what do you recommend?" And I remember he just looked at me and said, "I'm afraid, Prime Minister, this decision's for you." So anyway, I took the decision to keep the network open, because otherwise I could see us shutting down the country and then the terrorists win anyway without even doing anything. And anyway, fortunately nothing happened.
But you didn't sleep that night?
I didn't sleep that night.
טוני בלר היה עד לפני 3 שנים ראש ממשלת בריטניה. 10 שנים הוא כיהן בתפקיד, 3 פעמים ניצח בבחירות, יותר מכל מנהיג של הלייבור אי פעם. This was a compliment. האיש הזה בעצם הגדיר את הפוליטיקה הבריטית מחדש, בזכות הקסם האישי, היכולת להתחבר לקהל שלו, ובזכות אותו עניין חמקמק ששמו קריזמה. This one you got, right? טוני בלר נגע בפסגות שמעטים נוגעים בהן, רשם הצלחה היסטורית בצפון אירלנד, סיים את תפקידו עם ביקורת קשה ופופולריות צונחת בגלל ההחלטה שלו לשלוח כוחות לעיראק, ואז הוא הגיע אלינו כשליח הקוורטט למזרח התיכון, נחוש להצליח במה שרבים כל כך נכשלו לפניו. הוא בן 57, נשוי כבר 30 שנה לשרי, אבא ל4 ילדים, הגדול בהם בן 26, והקטן בן 10, הילד הראשון מזה 150 שנה שנולד ברחוב דאונינג 10 לראש ממשלה מכהן. Mr. Blair, thanks again so much for being with us. I want us to talk about you, but first to ask you about us. Are you more optimistic today than you have been when you first got here 3 years ago?
Yes, I am, curiously. I think there is a real chance for peace. I think Israeli people want peace. They've just got to have peace on the right terms, and peace with security, really.
What is it with this conflict of ours, with this impossible conflict of ours that grabs you, that attracts you so forcefully?
It's a good question, actually. I sometimes wonder about that, because I love being here.
What is it that you love here?
I know it's partly, I think, for me, partly, I think, because I love to be in the Holy Land, which is for me the Holy Land as well as for you. But it's partly because I love the sort of Israeli spirit that there is, that has created the country. It's a very free, independent spirit. I like that. I think there's a lot of energy in it. And I think also, most of all, if we're able to resolve this issue, it's a great harbinger for a better type of 21st century, because this is a dispute in a very small bit of territory, but with global implications.
We'll talk about that later. When you speak, I hear your totality. I hear the way that you take things in a total manner. Can one succeed in politics without this kind of totality?
I think not, really. No, I think you need to have a big picture vision, but then it doesn't often help you to have it. Because the most difficult thing about politics is that realities change.
And so,
for me, when I came into politics, or as Prime Minister in 1997, I walked into Downing Street. I was the youngest prime minister, 150 years. My mind was full of healthcare and education reform and domestic issues, and I ended up in, 4 wars and foreign policy being a dominant part of my premiership. But then everything changed after September the 11th for us. So, what happens in politics is that you have to have that big picture vision, but on the other hand, there is always a changing reality you have to deal with.
And reality sometimes takes over. But there's something else about politics and about politicians and about yourself as a politician. I came across the other day into a brilliant speech of yours. You delivered it in the Beijing Olympics, and it was, I guess, an attempt to decipher the notion of what it is to be a champion. And you explained that you have to want to succeed, and you have to be inquisitive, and you have to be self-disciplined. But then you say, most of all, you have to have the courage, and you have to be prepared to fail. Do you think that the leaders of this country today have the courage to go for it?
I do, in fact. I mean, look, one of the things that's most difficult when you're in your own country's politics is you kind of see all the worst aspects of your politicians. But actually, if you're an outsider like me and you come in and you look at Israeli politics, and I've dealt with 4 Israeli prime ministers, I think, now. And the interesting thing to me is that actually each one of them, though very, very different people, has one quality that I think is very transcendent in Israeli politics. They do ultimately care more about the country than anything else. Now, I know you probably think, oh, no, that's rubbish. They're all out for themselves and greedy and grasping and all the rest of it. But that's not my experience. And so I think actually your political leaders, especially with this peace process, in the end, they all come to the same recognition, which is it is their duty to try.
But if you take Bibi Netanyahu as an example, and I take him as an example because he is the current prime minister of this country, he cares for this country in his own way. And my question is, do you think he's able to take he's willing to take the political risk, let alone, take an immense distance from everything he ever was brought up to believe in?
Yes, I do. But I think the thing that's most important about him, and I spend time with him and talk a lot with him, is that he doesn't want to have an agreement that isn't an agreement that can become a reality. In other words, his desire is not to give people the sense that he's going to conclude a peace deal or even conclude a deal. He actually wants to get one that he can persuade Israeli people of and that is right for Israel. That's what I think. And so, for him, the overriding issue is to make sure that any Palestinian state that comes into being is one that can be a secure neighbor for Israel.
And for you, what is it that you understood about this conflict that you didn't understand before?
That's a really good question, actually.
About us Israelis, even more so.
I think what I didn't understand in the same way that I do now is how isolated Israel sometimes feels. And how, to us in the outside world, you see, we often look at Israel and we think, now there's a really powerful country, right? They're the sort of top dog.
And we are so scared.
And yet you come here and you realize, one, when you start to know the region better, you actually realize Israel is a very, very particular and quite isolated example of a certain set of values.
And you have to realize that the more threatened we feel, the less we'll be able and willing to take the risks.
Of course, exactly.
Now, I grant you that, there's a colleague of mine, Ari Shavit, who wrote sometime before, I guess, the disengagement. He wrote an interesting observation. He said, there is no nation more threatened than Israelis, and there is no nation more occupied than the Palestinians. Suppose we grant that. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think that expresses the simplicity, in a way, of the problem.
The simplicity?
Yeah, because I think that you cannot sometimes look at this issue in too complex a way. I personally think you could deal with all the issues to do with borders and refugees and all of these things. I think the toughest thing is to deal with the reality that each side has. And the reality for the Israelis is security, and the reality for the Palestinians is occupation.
And that's why you try to work bottom up?
Yeah,
to try
exactly.
to work from the model of Jenin, from what happens in the streets of Ramallah, and there to create a new reality before the political process comes in?
Simultaneous with, yeah. So my view of this is very simple. And I always say, you know, and I say this to my European colleagues particularly, think like the Israeli Prime Minister. Right? Don't think, you know, think as you would if it was your country, not another country. And the reality is, for Israel, that unless they can be sure the Palestinian state is going to be properly governed, securely governed, with the rule of law being operated in a proper way, then it's a risk. It's a small bit of territory. You know, the West Bank, right next door to, not just obviously to Jerusalem, but to Tel Aviv, to Ben Gurion Airport. You know, look, if you can't be sure of your security, you're not going to be inclined to grant a state. So the security issue for Israel is absolutely existential. Likewise for the Palestinians.
The occupation.
Well, they need to know that if they do take the measures necessary to start building the institutions of capacity to run security properly, to govern themselves, to start doing the things that states do, and, you know, if they do that, will Israel then get out and leave them to it?
But still, Mr. Blair, I'm afraid that your bottom-up approach will lead us nowhere if the core question is not answered. Will Hamas and Haniya, Abu Mazen and Fatah, will they go for the historical compromise? Will they strike a deal? Will they forego
That's the question.
The right of return?
In my view, for Abu Mazen and people, yes, I've no doubt at all he's sincere about peace. Hamas, it's an open question. But the issue is this: how do we create the circumstances in which there is a clear choice, right, for the Palestinians? In other words, you know, you can't be sure this choice is going to be made in the correct way, but we should be at least sure that the choice is presented so that it can be made.
But we have to be sure of something much deeper. We have to be sure that there is a credible Palestinian leadership backed by most Palestinians that is able and willing to deliver.
Correct.
Can we be sure of that?
The answer to that is we will find that out in the course of the process. I believe it, but if I was an Israeli, I wouldn't believe it until I saw it.
And there wasn't a moment in the last 3 years in which you felt it's hopeless?
No, I've never felt it's hopeless.
At which you felt that this is going nowhere, Hamas is going one way, Israeli right wing is going the other way, the dismantling of the settlements is impossible, this is going nowhere.
No, there's never been a time I felt that, funnily enough. I mean, you see, I think, because I spend a lot of time in the Palestinian territory and I spend a lot of time in Israel, and I am convinced that a majority of both peoples want peace. So the question is, can the politics find the way to deliver it?
You know, it's amazing. You spend so much time here, I guess, every fifth week?
No, it's a bit more than that, actually. I'm here, yeah.
Every month?
Every month, sometimes
more
twice
or
a
less,
month. Yeah.
And you master, I guess, the details, the minute details of our conflict to the point of where each policeman in Jenin is deployed, and, you know, how did the olive harvest yield in the West Bank over the last year. And it's funny because in Britain you were never considered the type for details, right?
Yeah, but that was always a bit of a myth. The thing about politics is you have to have the big picture, right? But when it matters, you've got to get down to the detail.
But he always said, you know, that he loves the poetry of politics rather than the prose of policy making. It was a myth?
It was a myth, really, because in the Northern Ireland peace process, I used to know where every, you know, watchtower was, you know, the ins and outs of police reform, every detail of the, you know, the north-south bodies. I mean, you can't solve these things unless you get down to detail. But there are politicians who spend their lives so immersed in detail they can't actually get anything done.
Perhaps you are taken out by your public persona. I mean that you have this elusive, you know, feature or characteristic called charisma, of which I want to talk a bit for the next few minutes. You are a charismatic person, you know that.
I don't, I mean, it's a judgment other people can make. I don't feel like that, I must say.
You didn't feel that way the night that Princess Diana was killed in a car accident, and you were there in front of the microphones doing what eventually transformed you into the most eloquent spokesman of national emotion in Britain. Didn't you realize that at that moment?
No, I didn't.
What